Hi, good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to our session this afternoon on how to build a pop-up movement with purpose. We're thrilled to have a full room here at South by Southwest on a rainy day, but a good day. I think we're going to have a lot of fun today, and I'm honored to be able to moderate this session with some really brilliant people, both some of whom I already knew and some of whom I was pleased to get a chance to get to know a little bit today, because they're people whose work I've been tracking, and I think a lot of you have been too. So I'll do very quick name, title introductions, and then we'll have each of them introduce their own work with the video that we finally have working. So thank you to the IT people for making that work. So first, I'm going to start with Komal Ahmad to my left here, who's the founder and CEO of Copia, and Seth Goldenberg, who's founder and CEO of Epic Decade, and Asha Curran, who is Chief Innovation Officer at the 92nd Street Y. And the 92nd Street Y is also, a lot of what we'll be talking about today, I think, is Giving Tuesday. And 92nd Street Y is really the founder of that movement and is really the heartbeat of that movement in a lot of ways. So I think that's what we'll be talking about today with her. With that, I will go one by one, and maybe we'll start with video, and then you can tell me a little bit about yourself right after, or tell everyone else in the room a little bit about yourself right after that.
Okay, World Hunger, the jig is up. We've been told that there's just not enough food to go round. It's an impossible problem. It's a scarcity problem. It's too big a problem. It's not our problem. It's not my problem. But what if we told you it's not an unsolvable problem at all? We have enough food on the planet to feed everyone that's hungry. Fact. Actually, we have more than enough. Bam, double fact. The real problem, well, we can't get it to the people who need it. Until now. Welcome to the first time in history that we have the technology to connect excess food with hungry mouths. The homeless, the poor, the kids on the street, Copia connects them all with the food you haven't used. I'm not talking soggy scraps and half-eaten pizza crusts. I'm talking the kind of food that feeds your Instagram feed. Quinoa salads, sourdough focaccias, and freshly made salads with those little cherry tomatoes. We serve amazing food because we believe in the people we're serving. Copia doesn't have a dream, we have a plan. One that works, one that you can be part of. Copia, there's more than enough.
Hi, good afternoon. That was very enthusiastic, guys. Proud of you.
Let's get a little more.
Thank you. My name is Komal Ahmad. I'm the founder and CEO of Copia. And my journey with Copia began a few years ago when I was a student at Berkeley, and I encountered a homeless man begging for food. Something about him compelled me to stop and invite him to join me for lunch. And during lunch, he sat across from me, just scarfing down his food. So he was unbelievably hungry. It wasn't a ploy or anything. And in between bites, he shared a story. He said, "My name is John. I just came back from my second tour in Iraq. I've been waiting weeks for my VA benefits to kick in. And because I haven't eaten in 3 days." And that really hit home for me. I mean, this is a veteran, someone who had given the most selfless sacrifice for our country, only to come home to face yet another battle, which was hunger and homelessness. And then adding insult to injury, right across the street, Berkeley's dining hall is throwing away thousands of pounds of perfectly edible food. And so it was this very stark reality of those who have and waste, and those who are in need and starve. And those two people literally right across the street from one another. And what I realized is this is emblematic of a much larger problem, and that's that every single day in America, over 365 million pounds of perfectly edible food is wasted. And I'm not talking about last night's pad thai or this morning's half-eaten croissant, but untouched, unopened, incredible food. And while that's happening, 1 in 6 don't know where their next meal is coming from. So clearly, it's not a lack of food that's the issue. It's just an inefficient distribution of it. Hunger is not a scarcity problem, it's a logistics problem. And so the question is, how do we solve that logistics problem better, faster, and more lucratively for all parties involved? And that's how I built Copia. Copia helps businesses and events organizers that have surplus food to easily request pickups of their food, and our algorithm will match that exact amount and type of food to the nearest nonprofits who can accept it at that day, at that time, in that quantity, which is incredibly hard, along with a food hero who will come pick up that food and drop it off to that nonprofit. And then as a full circle, we send photos and testimonials back to the food provider so that they get to see the impact that they made by spending less than 2 minutes of their time essentially going Copia. And we also provide them data and analytics that help them reduce that waste over time, along with enhanced tax deductions. So they get to, essentially save money and make money by doing the right thing. And we're on our way to feeding 1 million people, all with food that would have otherwise been wasted. We we partnered with the Super Bowl, where we recovered 14 tons of food and fed 23,000 people in just 2 days. And a few weeks ago, we partnered with the Oscars and the Vanity Fair party, and we got food, most of which I can't pronounce, and fed 1,100 people. And so we're trying to essentially solve hunger and food waste at scale.
Awesome. Thank you. And with that, let's jump into Seth's video here. And
this whole space is about kind of reclaiming the conversation about how to tell the story of Rhode Island to the rest of the world, but by Rhode Island. Really engage people here in Rhode Island about their own experiences. Rhode Islanders are the biggest tour guides and ambassadors together out there.
The story, to be authentic, needs to be told by the person experiencing it. There are definitely things when you read this wall that make Rhode Island different than any place else. People have such a connection to it because it doesn't feel like anywhere else. Those are the stories you want to hear.
Rhode Island is the lively experiment, and that has been proven through almost 400 years of this place's history.
Roger Williams, and the reason why he believed in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the first synagogue in the country was formed here.
This is where the Industrial Revolution in America really began.
This is manufacturing and innovation, the schools.
Our contribution to the world is huge.
The sort of driving theme of the talk is making the ordinary extraordinary.
And how can we do that in a way that helps people to understand us?
So as Rhode Island, a little estate, we have successfully claimed the big wide ocean.
What makes Rhode Island magic isn't just the buildings, the beaches, or the places, it's the people.
We have amazing talent here.
The most creative, collaborative, compassionate group of people I've ever met in my life.
What can we do together? You have these skills, I have these skills, let's do something.
They're always doing something new. They're always doing something interesting. They're always doing the unexpected.
Welcoming and warm, and people are really adaptable to different situations and really great at collaborating, I think.
There's a sense of community everywhere I go.
So many good people.
Everyone I've met here is very different, but very special and has a really cool story.
We have great creative minds here.
A unification of cultural diversity, always identifying with each other.
Rhode Island is in my heart.
Rhode Island, you're in my heart.
Really dear to my heart.
So I love Rhode Island.
I love Rhode Island.
And I love Rhode Island because it's where my entire family is.
For all the love that it's given me.
And we love Rhode Island, we love our communities, and they're passionate to make changes in those communities for the good.
I really like living here because this place is small enough that I can actually affect change.
Rhode Island is just a special, special place.
I've never experienced anything like what I discovered here in Rhode Island.
It's just one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to.
There's really nothing like the Rhode Island experience.
Thank you. It's I think, one shining example of Epic Decade's work. So, Seth, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So, I apologize for my voice. I'll struggle a little bit, but hopefully we'll get through it together. I'm the founder and CEO of Epic Decade, a design think tank firm, ironically based in Rhode Island. And what you're looking at is one of our projects that we carried out last year. As a design studio, we have been studying and experimenting with how to design social movements. And we were engaged as one of the social change agent organizations for a tourism campaign in Rhode Island put together by the governor's office. And if you heard anything about it, a very famous designer in New York made a new logo and created a new tagline, and the state of Rhode Island and much of the world totally rejected it. It was called Cooler and Warmer, if you heard about it. Very popular in the social media for all the wrong reasons. And the governor's office asked us to help step in, lean in, and try and kind of take the bug and make it the feature. What you're looking at is a little bit of a video in which we literally, as the panel's called, took over a storefront and created a pop-up laboratory for citizens to reclaim the story of Rhode Island on their own terms. And this, for us, was up for about a month. We had an event, a project, a school group, a nonprofit there every day of the month for that month. And it became a kind of new town commons. We're experimenting with how design can be a force for constructing civic discourse. We do this in all of our work, whether we're working with governments or Fortune 50 companies, and we're very interested in how design and public engagement meet. And so, just as I think you heard a moment ago, I love the proposition of the first video of, these are not impossible problems. We would say in our design language, it's just a design problem. There's a way to solve the problem. And I think what we're seeing, and probably some of you are in the room, are practitioners of it, is how design thinking is not just necessarily a tool to make a better object, but design thinking is a catalyst to invent new social systems. So we're very interested in how social systems unfold and behave, and we construct them, the environments for them, the forums for them, the forces for them, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Excellent. Thanks, Seth. And with that, we'll jump over to a video about Giving Tuesday.
Global Day of Giving that's grown into a movement uniting people around the world. It's simple. After you get and get, you get a chance to give. Any way you want. Go online or down the street and find something you care about. Give, and then tell people about it. Sharing why you give will inspire others. It doesn't matter where you live or how much you give. Little actions can make a big impact. So find a way to give back this Giving Tuesday.
Excellent. So Asha, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with Giving Tuesday.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Chief Innovation Officer at the 92nd Street Y, which for those of you who don't know what that is, why would you? It's a very old, very renowned cultural institution in Manhattan on the Upper East Side. It is, 92nd Street Y. It's an awesome place. And we do a lot of things and have for a really long time. We have a nursery school and art classes and a senior center and a gym, and I could go on and on. We serve a very local community. One thing we did not do, is to start social movements. So this was quite an experiment for us. But about 6 years ago, we were really thinking about how an institution like ours stays relevant in this day and age and really utilizes and leverages technology in interesting ways. We were also looking at Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and we were looking at the nonprofit world in particular and thinking, those 2 days are really awesome for the retail sector, right? They really make people a lot of money. And could there be a sort of equivalent day, maybe even a sort of counter narrative to the consumption of those 2 days following Cyber Monday? And that's how the idea of Giving Tuesday was born. We were also really thinking about how you experiment as an old institution with new models, how you think less like a traditional nonprofit. And so a lot of the way that Giving Tuesday was built was a huge experiment for us, and we were really willing to put it out there and have some of it really not work. So the idea was a day of giving that is cause agnostic, platform agnostic, that was all about people or organizations engaging in giving and the conversation about giving and using social media to talk about giving in whatever way felt meaningful for them. So we did a lot of early talking about, should we endorse this cause or the other cause? And we really felt like the exact opposite. Not only did we end up not endorsing anything in specific, we actually ended up dropping our logo entirely off of Giving Tuesday. So it exists as a completely unbranded movement, and I think that is one of the most meaningful things about it. So the things that have happened with Giving Tuesday over the past 5 years are phenomenal, and we're almost all very grassroots. So the directions that it took, the different tentacles that shot off from it, its global growth, its civic growth, all of that happened without us deciding that's going to be a big strategy for us. And in fact, the things that we decided at the beginning were going to be strategies for us, more often than not, just kind of ended up falling off. So when I was just saying to my friend Kaz over there, who's here tonight, that when people describe me as the leader of Giving Tuesday, I really honestly say I'm a follower of Giving Tuesday, because to me the definition definition of a movement is something that moves by itself. It moves because it's propelled by the community of people who engage with it.
Excellent, thank you. So with that, I will introduce myself quickly. I'm Caleb Tiller with the United Nations Foundation, and at the foundation, we see a big part of our job as helping to create movements that support the work of the UN on issues around global health, energy and climate, girls and women's empowerment. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation today and to learn from some colleagues and experts here, and happy to be here in the room and have the chance to share some of this with you as well. And I also want to give a quick thanks to Havas PR, who is in the room somewhere. Rob is here on the right. I thank them because Havas is really the organization that drove the idea for this panel. They put in the concept into the panel picker, and they helped bring us all together today. So big thanks to Havas PR for their work. So one of the things I want to talk about, I think, first of all, it's an interesting time to be thinking about social movements. Obviously, in the U.S. context, there's been a lot of change in the last year and a half. People are more active maybe than they were even a year and a half or 2 years ago. But I think we all probably come to the room with a different idea or set of ideas about what a social movement is. So Seth, I'd like to, if I can, start with you, because I think you're probably in many ways the person on this stage who architects the most of these or helps design the most of these. So what is your thinking about how do you think about what a social movement is? How would you help define that term for us?
Sure. I mean, apologies. I don't think there's any operating definition, but that we should use necessarily. But we can have a discussion about our interpretation. So we spent a little bit of time today, the four of us together, and I think some of the threads we discussed is really that social movement, maybe more often than not, seems to imply and default towards a kind of sense of political activism or a kind of do-gooderness, as I like to call it. I'm not sure that's a fair analysis, as we have a more rigorous assessment of how social movements act as vehicles or as verbs in culture. For me, they are agnostic of a point of view, actually. It's actually a kind of way of moving ideas or way of communicating and engaging people in something. And social movements can be good or bad. They are agnostic of an ethic. And that is something to be aware of and not take lightly. And I think we see corporations and brands using the architecture and the vehicles of social movements. We see government and political and social organizations, but we also see religions. We also see, patterns of thought that are moved and circulating, of course, now more than ever because of the technology enabling a conversation to move, kind of seamlessly. So for me, I think the most discerning difference between, say, any communication and social movement in general is that social movements, no matter what their cause, seem to really try and align people with shared beliefs. And again, that is agnostic of what the belief is, but moving people through platforms and contexts in which they can galvanize around a shared belief is the kind of core, almost like chemical property to me of what a social movement is.
That's great. Good. That's really helpful starting point. And Asha, one of the things as we kind of planned for this, we were talking about pop-up movements and what does that mean? And one of the, we kind of thought of it more as much of pop-up being temporary, but also really meaning that it's grassroots and bottoms up, as opposed to a top-down kind of approach, which you talked a little bit about that in sort of the origins of Giving Tuesday. How would you characterize, the success of Giving Tuesday? What is it that has helped make Giving Tuesday become a movement?
Actually, I think part of it is exactly to what Seth just said, which is the sort of aligning people, right, who are driving toward a common purpose, who believe in a similar thing. With Giving Tuesday, that thing is really interesting because the thing that they believe in commonly is giving, right? But they could disagree on everything else. So what we see with Giving Tuesday is this really interesting form of civic participation that is not based on natural divisions like party affiliation or multiple other demographics, but instead people being able to come together around what is actually a very common, very universal value held by every religion and people with no religion and every single geographic area, which is this really human desire to give back, this really common expression of love for our communities and our family and so forth. Voting gets all the attention as a measure of civic participation, but philanthropy, right? Philanthropy giving is actually an equally important measure of civic participation. Communities that give are healthy communities. And the giving world, right, for those of us who are in that world, who have devoted our working lives to working in nonprofits or related and social enterprise or what have you, we really don't give ourselves enough credit for forming sort of the basis of civil society, right, which is really driving forward those kinds of values. Anyway, to your actual question, I think that the phrase pop-ups stuck with me a little bit because it implies that that these sorts of movements literally just sort of like burst out of nowhere and then people choose to engage with them. And that's not my experience at all. In fact, Giving Tuesday was very mindfully and intentionally designed. Very careful decisions were made about it along the lines of should it be cause agnostic, platform agnostic, should we take sponsors, things like that. And it was designed incredibly collaboratively. The birth of Giving Tuesday was really just before there was even a team, some of whom are here today. Hi, Kate. Before there was even a team, it was really just me and my boss doing a road trip across country, seeing if people would host meetups where we could talk about the idea and get input into it, right? And UNF was one of our very, very first stops, and you guys climbed right on board and partnered with us in the beginning. But without that kind of collaborative feed-in, the movement would have never taken the shape that it has. And so the key is, how do you design something that intentionally and give it the structure it needs, and then really let it propel itself forward and let the people who engage with it really shape where it goes, because everything that's happened with it since has been, as you say, incredibly grassroots. So I think there's a real balance there between structure, like sort of a framework, and then a lot of freedom within that framework.
Great, thank you. And Komal, do you see Copia as a movement per se?
So we believe we're solving the world's dumbest problem. In a world with so much technology, so much innovation, so much abundance, hunger shouldn't exist. So of all the problems in the world that we're not attempting to solve, this is one that can be solved. We waste 3 times as much food as there are mouths to feed. And what we've seen is that this is something that exists in every city, in every country around the world. That you see so much food wasted while so many people go hungry. And so we've received over 60,000 requests for global expansion from as far as Germany and Austria, government officials who say, we want to use this platform, we want to pay for its technology and expansion to help redistribute food and other resources to the Syrian migrants. That was definitely not a use case I could have thought about when I was a student in college. But this is the potential. And I said this to my team yesterday. I was like, it's both terrifying and exhilarating how the possibilities are. I say I dream pretty big, right? I think that that we can eradicate world hunger in our lifetimes, but the potential, I haven't even dreamt of it yet. And we are redistributing the most perishable resource there is through the use of technology. We're redistributing food. And with that same type of technology, we could redistribute medicine, medical supplies, books, clothing, because it's not a lack of resources. It just needs to get to the people who need it when they need it the most. So think about this in disaster relief. Think about this, there's just so many possibilities. So to answer your question, I think that it is becoming a movement. And you also see this in Europe, which is far more advanced than the US, where France has banned food waste. And it's not like a slap on the wrist. It's an $80,000 fine punishable by 2 years in jail. So they take it seriously. And I think that same type of mindset will hopefully permeate here too. for as long as we believe in climate change, I think that people will realize that, if food waste were a country, it's the third largest producer of methane in our environment after China and the US, which is crazy. Wow. So those, and even if you put the environment aside, this is a social issue. It's a public health risk. It's by providing the first step, you can't talk about education, you can't talk about health if you're hungry. Like a Snickers commercial, you're not you when you're hungry. And I think that using that premise, this is becoming a movement pretty rapidly, and we want it to become even a larger movement, and that also requires civic participation. It requires people like you in the audience either making connections or getting your businesses or your companies on board to also get their excess food to people who need it, and using platforms to do that in a very safe, easy, streamlined way.
Great, thank you. Seth, I think you had something to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I think both my colleagues said this, but I want to really underline it. It seems like a no-brainer, right? But another critical definition of social movement is that you're releasing control, which is a no-brainer, but it's worth unpacking what that really means. When you hear about designing a different kind of model and it's intentional and it's architected, but then you heard, I'm a follower, not the owner or the leader, or I didn't know this use case until an invitation happened. That requires a fundamental different business model, nonprofit or for-profit, to begin from the place of designing something that is decentralized is a very different design problem, as we would call it. And it changes the way you create value and how you have to govern and navigate how to grow something that is not a kind of tangible thing that you have in your hands and you're controlling along the way.
It's a great point. It's one of the things as a communicator, one of the things that is kind of a running joke that people talk about is you get this kind of demand, if you will, that people say, will you just create a video that will go viral, please? Right? And it's kind of similar to what you're saying, right? A movement. You just go create a movement for us, will you? Right? It doesn't quite work that way.
And I think one thing that I've realized is that, things happen on accident more often than not. I didn't think that you could use technology to eradicate hunger, but, I started, just as like the second half of my story, after I met with John, I went to our dining hall managers and I asked them, what do they do with their excess food? They're like, oh, well, we don't have any. And I was like, okay, well, how often does that actually work out? And after a lot of humming and hawing, they're like, well, we do actually have excess food, but we have to throw it away. So I asked the obvious question, why would you throw it away when you could go literally across the street in People's Park and donate it? They said, because of liability, we don't do that. I was like, yeah, homeless people's high-powered attorneys are standing by just to sue you. And I just thought it was like such a excuse that it's just a complete BS excuse. It's so much easier, and this is something you guys will learn, and I'm sure we have too, it's so much easier to say no than it is to say yes, because yes requires action. And, and I was not going to take no for an answer. So I went online and I found out that in 1996, Congress had passed the Good Samaritan Act that protects all donors, regardless of whether you're a corporation, organization, or individual, when you're actually giving away your food. So I printed it out, I took it to our executive director, and I said, we have to start this. This is the right thing to do. You're not going to be held liable. And, I'm pretty persistent when I want to be. So within 7 minutes, he agreed, and we started the nation's first food recovery movement on a college campus. And it was essentially, students recovering food from our dining hall, our on-campus events, our stadium, our arena, and then redistributing it directly within our community. And it was a great start, hugely inefficient. One day I was in class and our dining hall manager called me and he's like, hey, Komal, no one came to this event, so we have 500 gourmet sandwiches left over. They need to be picked up in 2 hours, otherwise we're gonna have to throw them away. We need the freezer space. He's like, do you want them? And I was like, yeah, of course I want them. So I grabbed my bag, I dash across campus, I jump into a zip car because no one has a car at the time, go through all our one-way streets in 4 p.m. traffic to the loading dock, and I'm loading this food in my trunk by myself, and this is perishable food, so I have to move as quickly as possible. I'm blasting the AC, and I'm frantically getting this food in. I slam my trunk shut, and I'm like, this is amazing food. Of course people are going to want them. And if you've ever been to San Francisco, you cannot pass a block without seeing the kind of need that there is. And so I call all of the nonprofits that we had in our system at the time in Berkeley, in Oakland, even as far as Richmond. A third of them don't answer the phone. A third of them say, no, we're okay for today, thanks. And the last third are like, yeah, we could use 10 sandwiches or 15 sandwiches. Like, awesome, now I have 475 sandwiches. And I'm literally on the side of the road so frustrated. I'm like, why is it so hard to do a good thing? Why is it so hard to do the right thing? And where are all the hungry people at when I actually have great food to give them? And I remember just literally on the side of the road looking at my phone and thinking, okay, well, I gotta figure this out. So I tried to extend my Zipcar reservation and I couldn't because someone had already booked it. And so I was like, this is Murphy's Law in action. No good deed goes unpunished. But I remember thinking, like, how much better this would be if those who have food could say, hey, we have food, and those in need of food could say, hey, we could use that food. And we match these two people and clear the marketplace. And that frustration, that side of the road moment was really what spurred this movement for me and spurred the answer of what could be potentially the solution to solve, this intractable problem that's existed since the beginning of time. So accidents.
I love that story. Seth, I think it's probably not an accident story, but can you tell us a little bit about the Nexus North project that I heard you describe earlier?
Sure, yeah. So the Rhode Island project, again, is one of many projects in our portfolio. One that's another interesting case study is some work we did in northern Canada, in Alberta, called Nexus North. And Nexus North was a 2-year focused endeavor in which we built a network of about 100 organizations who were involved in the oil sands and the tar sands. And similar to the world's stupidest problems or dumbest problems, I think it also relates to my point about social movements having a kind of agnostic point of view. In a progressive environment, it seems like you can't touch certain problems. No, a progressive, innovative person can't go up to northern Alberta into the oil sands and apply design thinking to solve that problem. You have to stay away from it. It didn't make sense to me. So my short story, similar kind of strange moment was I was invited to give a talk at a place I never thought I'd be, which was a oil sands membership club. And I gave a talk about how design thinking could be a tool to figure out what a sustainability framework might look like when you're dealing with $1.3 trillion of oil coming out of the earth. And I told them at the time that, a lot of my friends didn't want me to come up to Alberta and talk with these folks. This is like, the poster child of not feeling it, like, don't get on that plane. So I put up a slide with Darth Vader on it. And I told them that this is how the world sees them. Just saying. But that, I don't think that they wake up every morning trying to harm the planet. I think I just don't intrinsically believe that. And we have some processes that might be useful. So we brought together more than a dozen oil companies, a series of tribes, chiefs from the region, as well as NGOs and municipalities. And for 2 years, we held a series of what we call ideas salons to develop a shared language to figure out how might we deal with this big elephant in the room, which is everyone views us as the curse of sustainability. What would it be like? How would we have to work together to become a model for sustainable practices? And some of the work that I got associated with led to really amazing examples of action forward. I mean, this is a century scale problem. We're not going to solve it in 2 years, but we created a language. And one of the things that came out of that, and again, we don't claim credit, but it was a part of the discourse, was that the oil companies signed an agreement that was a landmark agreement to free up the very competitive patents and intellectual property that had to do with environmental impact. So for the first time ever, rather than companies competing for the price of extraction per barrel, for the first time ever, literally hundreds of billions of dollars of intellectual property became free to be shared so that they would not compete on anything that had to do with environmental impact. And so it became literally a portal and a domain of resources for people to accelerate at 10-year steps by trading for free the patents and the tools and the engineering to extract oil in a more safe way. So this for me is an example of what we were talking earlier. Some social movements are wide and are civic, and maybe we don't have control, just as we were saying earlier. But also to do big industry move the needle business, sometimes you can curate a social movement, not that you're controlling it, but a kind of B2B social movement in which you construct a framework for a series of entities to work together and collaborate in ways that are maybe not about their singular corporate interests, but about the shared interests that move a whole industry forward. And that's very interesting to us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and definitely not something that I had remembered reading about or hearing about. So I was glad to hear it from you, and I want to look up and learn more about it. Asha, so Giving Tuesday every year, first Tuesday after Thanksgiving. What happens the other 364 days of the year?
Nothing. We just hang out and
Chill in.
Okay,
wait for the day to roll around. I collect my paycheck. Yeah. I know I keep just answering the last question before I answer the current question, but I'm just going to do that one more time. So I think I was just thinking while you were talking that I think a really important part of what defines, what separates a movement from a program or a campaign is a feeling of generating accountability in the people who engage in it. In other words, I think that when you look at almost any industry, right? When you look at any sort of vertical or sector, you look at like global development or you look at philanthropy, there's a real tendency for people, just in general, to assume that other people who are professionals in that world are going to do the stuff that needs to get done, right? So like if I think about like big global issues that are really terrifying and scary and so forth, I think like the people at the UN or whatever will take care of that, won't they? But if there's a movement around that makes me feel like, oh, wait, I'm actually equally accountable for those issues, right? That's part of what defines a movement to me. And with philanthropy, I think there's also a thing like, well, the billionaires of the world will take care of that. Like they'll give what needs to be given, right? And I can't make much of a difference. I don't make that much money, and I have things that I need to spend money on. And once we start sort of generating that sense of accountability in massive amounts of people, I think that is really part of what defines a movement. So in answer to your question, there's two sides to Giving Tuesday. One is the sort of public side where we're really about, or the movement is really about catalyzing giving on a really grand scale and really widening the lens in terms of what we even think about as being giving, right? What do we think of how we are giving on a daily basis, right? If you each think of somebody you know that you would define as a giving person, do you actually know what they write in their checkbooks to nonprofits? No, that's probably not what you mean by being a giving person at all, right? So why do we have that kind of bifurcation? What are people doing in terms of the unique skills that they possess? What are they doing in terms of many other things, not just volunteering, but all kinds of non-obvious ways. So Giving Tuesday is sort of about enfranchising everyday givers. It's not about getting the Warren Buffetts and Bill Gateses of the world to write even bigger checks. It's about making everybody realize that we all have something to give. We all have a massive amount of impact we can make. The other side of Giving Tuesday is really much more sector focused. It's about looking at the social sector and really thinking about how you rapidly accelerate adoption of innovation and creativity and best practices. So I think what I've seen with Giving Tuesday over the past 5 years that's been so inspiring is a massive amount of, again, grassroots creativity that has bubbled up from cities and towns and municipalities and states and countries around the world where, by the way, there is no Thanksgiving or Black Friday or Cyber Monday, right? They just love the idea of a day of giving and make it work in a lot less fertile giving territory than exists here in the United States, but all over the world, right? In the nearly 100 countries that engage with Giving Tuesday now, our world, the social sector, faces almost exactly the same challenges, which is really incredible if you think about it, because you're talking about vastly different cultural landscapes and tax codes and traditions of individual giving and so forth. But the challenges are really the same. Kind of the tendency for old habits to take form, for new ideas to sort of be ground into a mush of their original selves by endless committee meetings and never making it out to market until they're nearly dead. So like the opposite of entrepreneurial thinking. Lots of things that they have in common, and that's what we spend our 364 days a year focusing on. If there's one thing that I would love to see Giving Tuesday having done, it's to leave this sector in a better place than it found it.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a great answer. And Komal, if you could help me, I think this group would probably enjoy hearing a little bit about the fact that Copia started. You talked about your origin story, and then I think you're originally a nonprofit for a while, and now you're a for-profit. That, I think, is a fascinating transition for a lot of folks. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, we are solving the world's dumbest problem, not the Bay Areas, not even the United States, but that also requires some of the world's smartest people who also require salary. And, one thing that I think that the nonprofit sector sometimes has a trouble doing is to spend more than 90% of its time fundraising. And, this now that we know that we have a business model, so the way that we generate revenue is that, businesses are eligible for tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars back from Uncle Sam for actually donating food. So it's an enhanced tax deduction. And we take essentially a percentage of that because it's money that would have otherwise been left on the table or worse, in the trash, along with a volume-based fee for certain other customers. And so, now that you know that you have a revenue model that can help scale it, that's what we're trying to do. We're using technology to scale this in a way that by being a nonprofit, we never really could. And you see that. You see that most nonprofits don't have global footprints unless you're, an NGO or Bill Gates Foundation. But that's not. I think that by being a business, we are able to actually attract other customers too, and companies that want to partner because they see that we have a shared interest here and that we're going to exist in 5 years and 10 years. Hopefully we'll have solved quite a significant part of this problem, but we will continue to exist. And so I think that that's really, the majority of why we wanted to be a for-profit is that we can generate revenue, we can attract some of the world's best talent, and we can share a common business alliance here because we too want to generate revenue. And I think one of the most beautiful things about Copia, and it's not because I came up with it, is that everybody wins. The more food we recover from businesses, the more people we feed. The more people we feed, not only the better the world is, but also, the more money we generate. The more money we generate, the more quickly we can actually expand. And also our investors are far happier. So, that cycle of where everybody wins, businesses get enhanced tax deductions, they reduce the amount of food that they're actually throwing away, the environment benefits. These are so many different wins that doesn't really exist in a common modern day business. We are the proof that you can both do well and do good, and those two things don't need to be in contradiction. And they're not like accidental goods. They're not like, you buy a pair of an item and you get another item goes shipped somewhere else. That's not really it. It's like it is very directly in our day-to-day practice. Everything we do is actually propelling humanity forward.
Yeah, it really seems like a new way to really define shared value in an interesting way. And I love the idea that the businesses that you're working with are your customers, as opposed if you're in a nonprofit world, they'd be your partners or your funders or your supporters or something like that. But the fact that they become your customers, I think, puts it in a really different light, which is, I'm sure, drives the way you do your business very differently.
And it's also helpful that this is, a non-controversial, nonpartisan, no-brainer, right? No one's like, I want to waste food and I want a shit ton of people to go hungry. Like most people don't think like that. They see that food has some value and that they want to actually, share that value. And I think especially you see that in chefs that spend so much of their time putting their effort into cooking this incredible food, and then just to see at the end of the night that, people were picking at it or so much of it goes wasted for a variety of different reasons. And so I think to also show the kitchen staff and to show, organizers and meeting planners that actual food went somewhere. And another, final thing is that, we believe that the food that we redistribute is some of the highest quality food. It's lobster rolls and, $300 cheeses and quinoa and squash salad and things, people, they eat a lot better than I do on a daily basis. So the idea is also that it doesn't matter what socioeconomic status we have, that everyone has the right to eat with dignity. Everyone has the right to eat a high quality meal, and because that's going to be the stepping stone by which that they can actually move forward in society. All of our drivers, quite a few of them were previously homeless or recipients of our food. And so now they're actually paid, they're paid food heroes is what we call them. And that means that it's not just a handout, but it's a hand up. We're actually trying to solve other problems in this process as well. And I think that as a nonprofit, you're not able to sustain that and scale that in that way. And, volunteers are great. I mean, this is run by so many incredible ones, but it's not reliable, and you have to be reliable to have happy customers, and you're also redistributing, again, the most perishable resource there is, so you can't have that just sitting around. And when you have paid drivers and a scalable model, that helps actually accelerate that food recovery and waste reduction process.
Great, thank you. Well, we've got about 15 minutes left, so with your permission, I would love to turn this over for some Q&A to the audience. We've got a mic here in the middle of the room. Please, step on up. Is there? Sorry, I don't know if that mic is on.
Repeat it. So there we go. Okay, I'm Kaz. Hi. This is for you, Komal. A question specifically. I've spent a lot of time working on food deserts and models. I have my own company called Curious Catalyst, which does design thinking and innovation, and I've taught for the last 4 years at Think, which is a school for creative leadership where we believe in for-profit business models. But we focus a lot on scaling, and I'm sitting here reflecting on 2 years ago when I was at South by at a food panel, and many of the questions were like, great ideas, but how do we scale that? And what you've described in terms of growth requires additional capital. So I'm hearing implicit in what you're saying that in order to continue scaling to different regions, you need more capital. And fundamentally, one of the biggest questions I have is for-profit businesses, most of them have not embraced the kinds of playbook models that many nonprofits will adopt over time for scaling. And like my favorite, I always tell entrepreneurs, go read the SSIR article saying, what's your end game, right? And sort of opening up, and I come from open source tech. I noticed that your tech is proprietary on your website. And I've also, I've shared your company with others, but I do wonder, you're fundamentally pointing at an expensive resource, which is building the logistics distribution infrastructure. The tech has no cost as you continue to scale it. Or minimal maintenance, right?
So have you paid a San Francisco engineer?
I come from the tech industry. No, I hear your point, right? But for me, the question is, I want to actually see that problem solved globally. Yep. And by opening up the core of your logistics solution, you could have much more rapid impact. So my question is have you looked at scaling models which are not capital intensive, and have you looked at open core models so that you can reach and piggyback an open API onto things like Uber, which are already, right? And I know it's the obvious question, but you could be owning instead part of the hard cost infrastructure, which is really hard to build. So I'm just curious how you think about all those models.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you and me both, sister. We obviously want to solve this problem at scale too. And we think about piggybacking. There's a lot of logistics providers that exist. I mean, even when you think about the future, which is like drone technology, you can move food a lot faster and a lot quicker. I don't know how expensive it'll be, but it is the future. And I think that there are a lot of logistics providers, whether it's Lyft or Uber, that we can piggyback off of. There's also nonprofits that locally exist all over the country. We didn't invent the concept of food recovery. We just included technology to help drive that forward. We didn't want to be nascent in just San Francisco. We wanted to actually expand this quickly. So yeah, there's different ways that we think about scaling too. Right now what our focus was to create a playbook. And so we operate in San Francisco Bay Area. We wanted to see how does that how do we operate in San Francisco versus Silicon Valley? How does weather, how does geography, how does even different types of customers, change that? So for instance, in San Francisco, the distance between a nonprofit and a for-profit is 1 to 3 miles. But with traffic, that could take, anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour, especially when the Giants either win or lose and then you're screwed on Friday afternoon. But whereas in Silicon Valley, you can park, you can go up to a loading dock, but the distance between a for-profit and a nonprofit is 7 to 10 miles. And so, understanding these different things and then thinking about what cities, what is similar to San Francisco, how does that weather affect that? How do we operate in a university versus a stadium versus a hospital? And then how can we teach those lessons and actually use that same type of model to expand to Los Angeles, to expand to New York, to Chicago, and say, okay, this is the best way to actually operate food recovery at a hospital and waste reduction at a hospital. And so I totally am on board with partnerships. I mean, there's that model of actually learning something first. I think it's irresponsible for us to hand over technology to another organization that isn't able to actually handle it, use it, troubleshoot on it, and we still have to get through the kinks of just making sure that this can scale before we just say, here you go, use this, because you have to have all of that system infrastructure to back it up. And also, I mean, yes, distribution helps, but you also have to have the customers, right? You actually have to have the food sources. You have to have the food providers. You have to build those contracts in. And so, this is also why I think some of the best ways for us to expand is to partner with, the Sodexos, the Bon Appetits, the Compass Groups of the world, universities, hospitals, things that are also have both a national as well as a global footprint. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for, customers like that because we know we can solve a problem for them. We work with Bon Appetit at the 49ers. We've reduced their surplus by over 50%, which is tens of thousands of dollars that they're saving. And even though that's technically to an economic detriment to us because, they're giving us less food and we therefore make less money. But not really, because there's so much food that actually goes to waste that we can actually tap into. So, to sort of answer your question, there is no, unfortunately, playbook to eradicate world hunger. This is something that we're still figuring out, and we are so open to hearing from the brilliant minds that are in this room and beyond to find better ways to do that. I'm not pretending like I know every answer, because if I did, this problem would have been solved. And if the current model of what is happening with food banks and food pantries and SNAP, if that had worked, this problem would be solved. But clearly, whatever exists doesn't. And so technology has to meet humanitarianism, right? And this is where this is what the future is. And to be able to use the same technology you do to swipe right, to request an Uber or Lyft, and maybe not in Austin, but, yeah, sure. If you can use that same type of algorithm and that same type of logistics system that FedEx, UPS, all of these companies use, as well as the algorithm of Match.com, and you mix these two things and you then use that to actually build those connections, that is what we're trying to ultimately do.
Thank you. I think we have another question. Please.
Hi, my name is Alan. I just want to thank you guys for your great work and your interesting panel today. My question is, how do you bridge the gap between the ambition that oftentimes volunteers have to do the work that you guys might offer or people in person might offer versus what you actually can offer? As an example, after November 8th, which is not a great day in my life, I went to a few ACLU meetings to try to figure out what I can do to volunteer or help out. And everyone in that meeting who wanted to volunteer went in wanting to do actual work that the ACLU would try to solve. But really what the ACLU needs most is, money and fundraising efforts. But no one really is there to write a check. So how do you harness the energy that volunteers actually have when maybe that's not the best resource. Maybe they can't actually give the resource that is needed the most.
Sure. So I'll try to venture a really short answer to that, and then maybe anyone, I don't know if Asha wants to jump in or anyone else, please do. It's maybe oversimplifying it, but I think part of what we see at the UN Foundation is that working with volunteers, there's no short, easy answer. There isn't an app for that, right? It's working over a long period of time with people who are really dedicated to a cause, and it's listening to them a lot. but also being honest about what you need as an organization. So one of the things that we found is really developing programs with people over time. We've got campaigns that we run or programs that we run that really were developed essentially in partnership with some of our biggest champions. So we run a campaign, for example, that's called Shot at Life, and it's about making sure that children in developing countries can get access to vaccines. And what we do is raise awareness mostly amongst Americans and raise funds amongst Americans to support vaccines for children in developing countries and making sure that they have the access that they deserve. But that program was developed, it's largely run by champions around the US who are volunteers of their time and their energy. And it was developed by listening to them about what they cared about, how they talked about the issue, why they cared about the issue, and what made them passionate. And so it's really a give and take, back and forth, I think, is part of the answer. That's not an answer to what do you do with those 50 people who show up at your door one day, but it's an answer to how do you work with those 50 people over time. I don't know if you want to add, if any of you all want to add something to that.
Well, I mean, I don't have an answer to it. I would just say that from where I've been sitting for the past few years, I just have to acknowledge that it's really an issue. I think it's an area that's kind of ripe for disruption or some radical new idea, because it does seem to me like there's a big gap between people who really want to lend their time to an effort that they care about and the things that are actually needed and the matching up between those. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's organizations doing great work with volunteerism and there's organizations doing great work with volunteers. But there's a lot of people like you and it's really a big issue. I mean, I guess I would say one thing that I've noticed is that people don't think nearly enough about donating their actual skills. They think about donating their time. I'm recalling a time when I spent a week at Intuit in Silicon Valley, and they were telling me how they're allowed a certain percentage, I forget what it is, of time to volunteer per week or per year or whatever it is, and they largely don't use it. And when they do use it, they'll go to a local soup kitchen and they'll ladle soup or whatever. And now I'm not saying that ladling soup is not perfectly worthy, but we're talking about a set of people with literally the most sought after skills on the planet, and they could be designing, engineering, coding for any number of causes. Literally just didn't occur. Right? So I think there's a big matching of like, what can you do that is useful and unique, right? The more unique, the better. And then who are you willing to loan those skills to? And then I think there's also some, a little bit of like, hear an organization when they tell you that what they really need is your money. They don't need your time. ACLU doesn't need you right now. They don't need your body. They don't need you to volunteer in that way. They really, really just need you to write checks. So I think there's some of that as well.
So maybe that's the world's second dumbest problem, and Copia can tackle that next.
Yeah, exactly.
We're getting close on time. Are there two questions here? Do you guys want to throw them both out maybe, and then we'll...
Hi guys, I just want to say thank you for coming. I think what you guys are doing are great, and we all should get involved. My name is Steven Stewart. I'm CEO and founder of Story Stable, an experiential marketing company and content production agency that specializes in social good. So my question is, how do you guys see the growing use of content storytelling being used to maximize awareness and public empathy for a project? Additionally, how do you see that content creation also being used to secure additional funding to grow the movement?
Yeah, so great question. One of the things that I'm never going to put a starving African children on our website and be like, boo-hoo, because I don't think the world needs more tears. I don't think the world needs to be more depressed right now. I think what the world needs is to be empowered and to be inspired. And so one of the things we're going to do is do a Humans of Copia thing where we get to tell the stories of the people that were actually fed. The veterans, the teachers, the students, the kids. I mean, the real true stories behind the faces of the actual people that we feed. And I think that that's probably one of the more powerful ways to do it. For the Oscars, we did different types of publicity where we said, for the first time ever, no food will go wasted at the Oscars. And that actually we were able to execute on that, and that everyone gets to eat like a star. And I think that having those kinds of branding behind it is something that's helpful too, and that we could continue to get help with. And I think that to go back to your point is where we could use and harness actual skill sets to tell this story, because this story a lot of these people's story needs to be heard by the world, and in a way that the world can understand that, hey, you know what, these aren't just like druggards or, just people who don't want to help themselves. So I think for us, that's how we have to get into storytelling. Before when I started this, I never wanted to put myself out there or my story out there. I was like, it doesn't matter who I am. It's the cause. And what I realized is people are like, yeah, okay, well, what's, it's eradicating hunger. Okay, that's like every other organization. But now that I tell my story, I think it's a lot more powerful because people see that, 5 years later, I'm still engaged in what I'm doing and that there is a reason, there's a why behind it. So as much as we can share our why and other people can share their why, I think that that's what also helps, propel a movement forward.
That's great. Other answers? Seth or Asha?
Well, I'd like to link the previous question to this one as well. I probably have a more radical view on the question, and I think this skills versus time comparison is a really beautiful way of framing it. I would add to it, just to kind of further push the envelope, that I think we believe there's kind of an old world and a new world, so to speak, at our studio at Epic Decade. And I think that there's a kind of dangerous naivete about thinking that the old world organizations or old world strategies will be useful in the new world context. And I so agree that time is no longer an exclusive form of capital. I mean, I would actually just let go of the word volunteer altogether. But I would also urge us to challenge ourselves to think differently about, is, in this case, ACLU, and I'm agnostic of a position, but I'm just using it as a case because you raised it. Is that the best, the only, or the proper Swiss Army knife tool to get us out of a problem that we're facing? And I'm not sure. I mean, we talk a lot about this. We work on this kind of question. Are we using the right vehicle to attack the problem that we're setting out to deal with? And I think it relates for me to your question. I'm not very interested in the use of storytelling from a marketing point of view. Frankly, I'd suspect of marketing altogether, but that's another debate.
I know.
I mean,
we can do that.
I mean, one of our slogans, by the way, is at our studios, if you have to tell people you're cool, you're not cool. Just saying, right?
You got to show them why you're cool.
For me, the storytelling part is interesting because I do think the part of storytelling that I'm seeing recently that's useful is the intellectual discourse of asking harder questions, which is what I'm proposing about the ACLU example. I think that the experiential communication that I imagine is the field of play that you're working in is ripe for being a tool to not necessarily leap too quickly to the answer, but to work as rigorously on, are we even asking the right questions? That's for me where storytelling and communication and experience media can be useful, and that's what I would advise.
Great. Thank you very much.
Can we make sure we get this last question?
I'm just trying to...
I can ask Seth after if you need to end it.
I don't know.
We probably should let people.
I noticed that some people need to get to their next session. So, sure, if you don't mind doing that, why don't we do that? I will... One last point I would like to make, I would invite all of you to come Monday, to the Social Good Hub, which is happening at TechSpace Austin. We'll be talking there. There's a lot of stuff going on there, really interesting programming. It's basically running 9 to 6 each day. But one of the things that we at the UN Foundation are doing is a treasure hunt for social good. So you can stop by and you can start there. You can learn a little bit about the UN Foundation's Sustainable Development Goals, which actually for me is interesting hearing today this discussion about top up versus bottom down, top down versus bottom up, excuse me. And thinking from if you don't know the Sustainable Development Goals, it is a global set of goals to get us to 2030 to eradicate hunger and poverty and provide good health for everyone in the world. And there are 17 of them, so I've just named 3 out of 17. But they are an incredible mix of, there were governments who wanted to achieve this through the UN come to this set of goals, but the ideas came from people around the world. So 7 million people around the world said what they wanted to see the world look like by 2030. And that was the driver for where we came up with these 17 goals. So come learn a little bit about those, and I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks again to Havas PR. And all of you, thank you.
Thank you.